There are currently 6 element state commands you can use to more easily inspect the state of your website and its elements. You can find them all on the API page under the State Nav section. Each state command accepts a selector and returns a true or false value depending on the state of the element provided. We're going to take a look at all 6 state commands and jump into examples for a few of them, beginning with the isExisting command. The functionality we'll be testing throughout this video is the review form on the product page. Review forms are fairly simple, accepting in an identification and the review itself. It gets a little tricky though when you try testing form validation as well. Starting off, I'm going to create a new file called review.js. In it, I'll create my describe block, defining this set of tests as the product review form. I'll start off by writing comments that name the test I want to create and outline the steps I will take. I like this method as it helps me plan what I need to do without having to worry about the code details just yet. For the first test, we'll be checking the basic functionality of the form. The steps for our test will be: go to the product page, enter the email address, enter text in the comment form, submit the review, assert that our review now appears in the list. Our first step is to load the product page. This step should be fairly familiar by now, calling browser.url and passing in the path to our page, in this case, productpage.html. For the next 2 steps, we'll be using the setValue command. This command replaces any existing value in an input field with the text passed in. We call it by sending the element selector and the text set. First, we'll add an email address to the form. We can get the selector by inspecting the email input element on our review form. You can see it has an ID of review email, which makes it simple to select. Let's copy that ID for our test. We'll call setValue and pass in the ID selector. Then we'll send the input, which should be a valid email address like email@example.com. We'll do the same thing for the comment field. It's a different type of form input, but because it still accepts text, we can still use setValue. Again, we'll pass in the ID selector of the input element, which is review content. For the value, the text, "this is the review," will work just fine. With the fields filled out, the form is ready to submit. To do this, we'll use a command called submit form. This is a very simple command, taking in just the selector of either the form element you want to submit or any element that is the descendant of that form. Since we already have it available, we'll use the selector for the review content input. Before we get to the isExisting state command, let's verify our comment was added. We'll use debug to pause the test execution after submitting the form so we can manually validate the review was added. Since we have other files in our test folder, when we call npm test, it will execute all the tests we've written so far. To run just the single review file, we can pass in a spec option to the WebdriverIO command. This tells WebdriverIO to only run the tests defined in that single file. Because we're using npm scripts to run the WDIO command, we need to prefix our option with 2 dashes. After that, we pass in the spec option with our file name as the value. Now when we run our test, it will load the product page, fill out the form, submit it, then pause as we debug the page. You can see the review submitted successfully, so we're ready to automate that assertion. Looking at the isExisting command API page, you can see it's a fairly simple command. It takes just one parameter, the selector of the element you want to check existence for. It will return the value true if that element exists in the HTML, and false if it doesn't. Notice in the example that it doesn't matter if the element is visible or not. It will always return true as long as the element exists on the page. Later on, we'll take a look at the isVisible state command, which does take into account the visibility. Back in our test, we'll create a variable called hasReview to assign the return value to. Then we fire off the isExisting command. For our selector, we'll use a text-based value, searching for an element with a class of comment that contains our exact text of "this is the review." With that, we'll assert that the hasReview variable is true, signifying that it found the element with the text. The last part of our test will be adding a better message in case we can't find the comment. In our assertion, we can pass a second parameter to the expect function. This is a string of text you want prepended to the assertion error message. For us, we'll say comment text exists. That way we get a better idea of what we're expecting. With that, we'll save our file and run our test. Since we still have our debug statement in place, the test will pause before that assertion. Seeing that the review is visible, we'll hit enter to continue with the test and validate that the assertion came back positive. The final thing we'll do is remove that debug statement, as now our test works perfectly. That's it for the isExisting command. In the next video, we'll talk about using isVisible to verify error messages show up when invalid content is submitted.